this March meeting of our social sciences occasional lectures. And my name is Nina Rosenstand, and most of you probably know that. And I am a professor of philosophy here at Mesa, and I chair this series here. And this meeting is not only one of our social sciences occasional lectures, but it is also co-sponsored by the Women's History Month. So some of you are, I hope, here because you've seen the beautiful posters that we have around campus. I am very pleased to be able to introduce today's speaker, and that is Brittany Adams, who is teaching here. She's a lecturer in history here at Mesa College. And a little bit about what Brittany is doing and what she hopes to be doing. She is right now working on her dissertation at UCLA in American Women's History, and she's also teaching at UCLA in addition to teaching here. And in terms of writing accomplishments, she already has some in her vita, because she's written a curriculum for national high school standards in history. So I'm very pleased to welcome Brittany, who's going to talk about the religious life of Judith SargentMurray.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I am pleased to be here in honor of Women's History Month, and I am very excited to present to you a figure of history that has not received a whole lot of attention. Many of you are probably wondering who Judith SargentMurray is and why you should know about her. So my goal is for, at the end of the few hours that we're here, that you will not only know her name and have name recognition, but believe that she is a person worthy of knowing. This woman was a published writer and an avid letter writer. She was a poet and a playwright, a political essayist, and most of all, she was a women's rights advocate. And she also contributed to the growth of a liberal Christian sect called Universalism. And what's interesting about her is that she can be considered a woman before her time. She lived in the late 18th century in the United States. And she is a rising figure of new historical importance. She, has been studied since the late 1970s and 1980s, but only in a limited capacity. So a project that I have is to try to bring her to more prominence, because I see a lot of value in studying her. For a while, literary critics had looked at some of her publications. But little work has been done on her true contributions to American religious history and also to American feminism. And so, this is what my presentation will focus on, these two aspects of her life. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from a really great, vast body of sources that she herself left behind. Judith SargentMurray maybe recognized that there would be one day where there would be a Women's History Month where people might want to talk about early women's, people who contributed to early women's rights advocacy, and so she copied every single letter that she wrote from the time that she was an adult until her death. And luckily, these letters were discovered about 15 years ago in a basement. And so all of a sudden, you had so much more information about her that you could really understand the complexity of her life. And what I have done is started to transcribe and look at some of these sources. They are microfilmed, and they're in this really tight scrawl that I have learned to read with some fluency over time, although it has been quite a tedious process. So this is where my information is coming from for the most part. She wrote about 2,500 letters, about 500 essays that were never published, and about the same amount of poems. So she was really quite prolific during her time. So there are three reasons why I want you to consider her an important figure. First of all, and here's a picture of her just so that you can have a face to a name. This was done by Copley, who is a very famous American painter. And what's interesting about her, and this can serve as a little bit of a symbol of the way that she lived her life, is she's not wearing a corset. And a corset is a type of undergarment that women would wear that you would tighten to make your waist look smaller. And it was an important fashion of the time for women of her elite circle. And she didn't wear one in her picture. which may just show a little bit of her rebellious nature against what women were supposed to be doing by refusing to wear that restricted garment. So she is someone that you could consider a founding mother of the early women's rights movement in America. That's one reason that she is worthy of your attention. Also, by examining her life and her ideas, you can better understand early American feminism. You can understand the way in which people first started to talk about women's rights and equalizing the sexes, equalizing the way that people understood both men and women. And also her religious beliefs are very interesting. They're of particular importance, not only because she was a part of a movement to found a new religion in this country called Universalism, but also because these beliefs very much influenced her thought and her feminism. So in order to fully understand her, I want to give you a little bit of context about the time in which she lived, because I'm not sure how much general knowledge you have about women in the American Revolution, so I'm going to give you a little bit so you can understand just how unique and important she was. She lived from 1751 to 1820. And what's neat about her life is that her life bridged the American Revolution. So she lived in the colonial era, she came of age and was in her 20s during the American Revolution, and then she saw the aftermath of the revolution, the early Republican era, and this is when she did a lot of her work and formed a lot of her philosophy about women. She also lived in a time in which the Enlightenment was very popular. This, of course, is a Western philosophy that was prominent in Western Europe, but also in revolutionary America. So a lot of her ideas were influenced by this philosophy. The best way to understand the environment in which she lived and the opportunities that were afforded women is to consider what gender meant, what being a woman meant in the years after the American Revolution. So I want to talk a little bit about what it meant to be a woman in that period. Because of both revolutionary ideology and ideas of enlightenment, there were some abstract concepts that were being frequently discussed. Ideas of liberty and independence and inequality. And there were questions about what that meant, particularly after the war. Who was equal? Who should have what rights? Who should be dependent upon whom and not? And there was an opening for discussion about change in this time period. Oftentimes, historians suggest that the American Revolution was only a revolution for white, free men. And in some respects it was. But it did provide a new opening for discussion about others' rights. And women's rights were heavily discussed in this post-revolutionary period. And there was this new opening for debate about the status of women. In a revolutionary work by a woman named Rosemary Zagarri, she really does a nice job of summing up what this era meant. She said, by celebrating the principles of equality and natural rights, the revolution established universal ideals as the benchmark by which American society would subsequently judge the fairness and equity of its policies. So basically, for a few decades following the American Revolution in the 1780s, in the 1790s, and maybe even the early 1800s, it seemed as if there was a possibility for significant change in women's status. Both the promise and the threat of women's rights issues were quite explosive. People reacted in positive and negative ways towards the idea of increasing the rights of women. The ideas were very much met with controversy. Some of these ideas and some of these calls for change in women's status was in the appreciation of the intellect of the female. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not women should receive more education, what they could contribute to politics, what they can contribute to their families, how much school should they get to go to. And these were all questions that were being heavily discussed. There was some mention of even expanding the political rights of women, although Judith SargentMurray herself did not specifically call for things like the right to vote or the right to be elected into office. So Judith SargentMurray was one of these women who took the opportunity of this post-revolutionary era to talk about the status of women and to call for change. And she called for quite radical and significant change. So much so that she became a controversial figure of her own time. She was aware of the risk of what it meant to challenge society. This was something that she was introduced to early in her life, which I'll talk about in a moment. And she wasn't alone. Judith SargentMurray was definitely one of the most vocal and most radical women, but she also had some companions at the time. Abigail Adams is known for calling for women's rights. Mercy Otis Warren discussed what women's contributions should be to the political sphere. And there are many nameless women that contributed poems and articles and wrote in journals, and also men who wanted there to be more discussion about such change. So she wasn't alone. She definitely was not the norm, but she wasn't alone. There was a small sector of women who embraced a more radical alternative. And what Zagari calls this is that they had an independence of spirit and an intellectual assertiveness that impressed some and alarmed others. And that's exactly what Judith SargentMurray did. She impressed some and she alarmed others. So she was quite worried, though, about the criticism that she would meet. And throughout her career as a published author, which she was in the 1780s and 1790s, she often adopted an alias. She said that she did this because she wanted, first of all, to be able to hear honestly what people had to say about her work. So she knew that if people knew who she was, they wouldn't tell her how good of a writer she actually was and how good her ideas actually were. But she also wanted to write as a man because she thought her ideas would be taken seriously. And if her ideas were taken seriously, and people believed in the quality of what she said, and she could later reveal herself as a woman, she would prove that women could do work as well as a man without going detected. And that's exactly what she did. Sometimes, historians overquote Abigail Adams' declaration to her husband that he remember the ladies. That's usually the iconic moment that we see after the American Revolution. Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, who became the first vice president and the second president of the United States, that he ought to remember women when constructing the new government. And sometimes Abigail Adams is the only voice that we hear when we take history classes in early America. And so what I want you to take away from this is that there's another prominent voice, and that is the voice of Judith SargentMurray. She was quite affected by the Enlightenment. SargentMurray was influenced by the era's willingness to engage in social critique and to talk about the supremacy of the individual human mind. So for SargentMurray, the mind was really the most important part of life on Earth. And the mind did not have a gender. This was this was a more commonly accepted belief that the mind was independent of the body and it did not have a sex in the same way. And so Judith SargentMurray would construct arguments about the need for women to have their mind cultivated because it didn't have anything to do with their body. Their minds were equal to men's. She was influenced by the fact that the human capability of reason or rationality or logic was a stepping stone to change. And she thought that if people believed that women could have, could have good reason, if they could logically think, if they could get over emotionalism, then they would be accepted as equal to men. In the years following the revolution, though, there was not as much progress as perhaps she had hoped. And this is largely due in part to this concept of Republican motherhood that developed. And what Republican motherhood was It wasn't necessarily new. It was an idea that had existed before in the United States and also in other countries. But it was the idea that women were best able to serve their nation as mothers and also as wives. There was a justification for education of women that lied in this. So if a woman was educated, she could better educate her children. Her sons would know more. They would be better prepared to be good citizens. And she could educate her daughters as well, also to one day educate her sons. And this was a concept that became very important in this post-revolutionary era. And it was used as a justification for education. More women were educated, more women became literate after the American Revolution. But in a way, this put them in a domestic sphere. It put them at home. It took them out of the public realm, out of the political realm that they had been in during the American Revolution, and it moved them back into the home. Because there were limitations on the need for women to be educated. If all they needed to do was educate their children, why learn advanced concepts? Why learn foreign languages? Why learn advanced mathematics? Those were things that men would learn later on when they went to college. So the idea was, yes, we need to educate women, but only to a certain extent. So more progress in that women were seen as protecting the virtue of their country. They were raising their children. They were educating their children. And that was a position of respect, but in a limited capacity. And what's interesting is that oftentimes historians call Judith SargentMurray a Republican mother. And here's just a painting of the era that was depicting this idea that mothers would take care of their children and be good companions to their husband. But what's interesting about this idea of Republican motherhood in terms of this lecture is that oftentimes historians link Judith SargentMurray with this idea. Historian Linda Kerber, who is one of the most famous of all women's historians of the early Republic, points out that women had a special role to play in raising their children. And she calls Judith SargentMurray the best example that she has of this Republican motherhood. And what I want to do is talk about how she may be a Republican mother. She did think that women should be mothers. She did herself value her role as a mother, but she wanted a little bit more. And historians have not seen the complexity of either her demands or the way that she lived her own life. I'm going to give you a little bit more background information about her. So again, she lived in 1751, or she was born in 1751 and died in 1820. And she, the advocacy for women's rights developed very early in her life. Her work was published before Mary Wollstonecraft, who's a well-known women's rights advocate, so she's working prior to this woman. She grew up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is a beautiful seaboard town outside of Boston, and she came from a very elite family. Her father was a wealthy merchant, and so she was able to have access to education and books and individuals who had been also very well educated in a way that many women were not. So it's important to note that she is not necessarily representative of the average woman. She did come from more elite circumstances, and her opportunities are reflected in that status. She had a younger brother who she tutored with. She went with her younger brother to a tutor who lived down the street, and she was introduced to very formal education in this way. But when her brother got a little bit older, he was sent off to an academy and then to Harvard, and she did not go simply because she was a female. And this experience definitely affected her for the rest of her life. She even commented that she had been better than her brother when they were studying younger. She was more committed, she was a better writer, but it was he, just because he was a man, who got to go off to school. And this was a pivotal experience that likely affected her desire for female equality. Throughout her life, she was very aware of the inequality of the sexes and very self-conscious about her lack of formal education. She believed that women needed to revere themselves. She believed that women needed to have self-confidence, and she wrote extensively about this. an idea that was somewhat unique at the time, even though that seems surprising from our modern perspective. She was married twice herself. She lived a traditional life in many aspects. She was a wife to a merchant named John Stevens, who ultimately abandoned her. And then she remarried a man that she called her soulmate, John Murray. And John Murray was the person who introduced her to Universalism, which was a religion coming out of England and founded by John Murray. It's something called a Christocentric Trinitarian liberal Christian religion, and that's a mouthful. What that means is that they believed in the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, that they were Protestant. They came out of a Calvinistic religion, out of a Puritan religion, but rejected certain principles, and they were liberal. And what that means is not, our understanding of liberal associated with Democrats and modern politics, but it was the idea that more individuals would have access to heaven. So there was a belief in more traditional Protestant sects, particularly Puritanism, that only some individuals would ascend to heaven. But Universalists believed that all mankind would ultimately go to heaven. It didn't matter what your behavior was, what your belief system was, what race you were, what gender you were. All human beings had equal souls, and all souls will ultimately ascend to heaven. God was benevolent, and he created all human beings to ultimately go to heaven. This is a religion that was influenced by Enlightenment thought. They believed that if you were a Universalist, you might go to heaven a little bit earlier than everyone else, but eventually everyone would be united. And they were not very clear about how long it would take for non-believers to get there, but they would get there. So this is the religion, just to give you a point of reference, that is now linked with the Unitarian Church. So you may have seen a Universalist Unitarian Church, and this is the religion, this is the history behind that church. Murray had first been a Congregationalist. So she first had been a Puritan. And she was introduced to the concept of Universalism through her father and also through John Murray, who was initially just a friend. And she came to these ideas of universal salvation and fully embraced them. And this was her introduction to rebellion. Universalism was a very controversial religion at this time, and you might understand why. People were very afraid that if everyone became Universalists, that they would no longer care about their moral behavior on earth. If you would ultimately go to heaven, why work hard? Why be faithful to your spouse? Why not drink alcohol excessively? And these were criticisms that were very heavily laid upon Judith SargentMurray and her family. So she had experience firsthand with what it meant to go against social norms. She experienced what it meant to be ostracized in a community. And she was a part of a fight for religious equality. She supported her husband, John Murray, as he was suing the state of Massachusetts for the right to have an independent church and to not have to pay taxes to the established state church, which they won. So she was a part of a movement to have more religious freedom. And it was this introduction to rebelling against social norms that prepared her for her later rebellion against gender norms. Universalism itself did not embrace the equality between the sexes. There were only male ministers. Women didn't vote in church matters. But it did have an ideology where people did extrapolate feminist ideas. If all individuals had equal souls and the body was inferior to the soul, and there was no gender with the soul, you could understand how people could come to ideas of equality. It was a democratic religion where all individuals could join, all individuals would go to heaven, and the most important part of life was to revere your benevolent God and to look forward to a time in which you would leave your body and be able to be with God without your gender. So, earthly life was not as important as the afterlife. So her religious beliefs influenced her feminism. And she was able to also step out of traditional roles through her religion. In a time when there were literally very, very few, maybe even no more than one successful female religious leaders, she was actively participating in strengthening Universalism. She wasn't a religious leader in the traditional modes that we might think of. She didn't preach. She didn't vote in a church. She didn't stand up and deliver sermons that she had written while traveling. She didn't do any of these things. But what she did do was write. And she wrote about religion. She was the first person to publish a Universalist document. And in this document, she asserted that as a female, she had every right to publish. She started this catechism off stating, I am a candidate for immortality, and this gives me the right to write religious documents. She also corresponded frequently with young ministers. She argued the fine points about religion, and she debated scripture with them. She wrote openly against ministers who disagreed with her and her husband. She distributed a pamphlet even to her church when a visiting minister talked about salvation in a way that she disagreed with. And throughout her writing career, she adopted religious tones. And they weren't just basic religious tones, they were universalist tones. She spoke directly about the importance of salvation and the equality of the souls throughout her published works. Some of her most famous works as well. For all of her seeming progressiveness, though, it's important that I tell you about some of her works. She was somewhat limited in her views. She was a devout Federalist. She belonged to the Federalist Party, meaning that she had an idea that there needed to be a hierarchy, that there were certain individuals that were more inherently talented than others. She was a friend and admirer of John Adams and also George Washington, so she was moving amongst the most elite circles at the time. And she had servants. She had servants who she thought were less than her in terms of her earthly life, not the afterlife. She was always careful to distinguish. But she believed that there needed to be hierarchy in order to keep order while on earth. That hierarchy would disappear in the afterlife, but on earth it was necessary. So she did not make any calls for the equalization of the classes. She thought that there should be class hierarchy. And she also did not make any calls for blacks to be freed from slavery. It's kind of hard to reconcile these concepts. It seems like incredible short-sightedness. But she was limited by her own experiences. As an elite white female, she called for the rights of an elite white female. She called for rights that she herself did not have and unfortunately didn't expand much beyond that. So her own experiences allowed her to see the shortfalls in the New Republic, and some of what she called for really just did pertain to women. That being said, though, she still very much contributed to the women's rights movement, and I want to speak a little bit more about how. So again, Linda Kerber, the sort of general opinion of her now is that she's the most vigorous single voice of the ideology I have called Republican motherhood. So people have put her sort of in this iconic role of being a woman who's calling for education simply so that they can be better in their domestic roles. And what I want to show you now is that she's a far more interesting and complex woman. She's often seen as this archetypal Republican mother, but she's a women's rights advocate who calls for the advance of female education for other reasons as well. While it is true that she doesn't make an overt call for political rights, she never asks that women have the right to vote. She doesn't ask that women be allowed to be ministers in her church. She does call for more equality in other arenas. And one of those is in understanding the importance of the female mind. There's surprising neglect of her religious life and her contributions to the growth of Universalism. So I'm going to show you now how her religious beliefs actually shaped her feminist ideology. One problem has been that her published works an essay called On the Equality of the Sexes, has received more attention than any of her other works, and that some of her private works have been completely ignored. And if you look at these 500 essays, and these 500 poems, and these 2,500 letters, as I have done, you will see that she talks about her religion more than anything else. And it's constantly at the forefront of what she's writing about, at the forefront of her mind. And this is not as well reflected in the limited works that she published. She wrote in the 1780s and 1790s for a weekly Boston journal called the Massachusetts Magazine. She also wrote for another magazine out of Boston called the Federal Orrery. And while some of these, some of the writings did have some more controversial ideas, she was most controversial in her public writings that she knew she could not publish. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what she says in both her published writings and also her private. One place to look for her unique ideas about women is in a letter that actually was published at the end of her most famous essay. It was widely dispersed in her time on the equality of the sexes, but it was the letter that came after that might be a little bit more interesting. In this, she reclaimed the story of Eve for women. And what that means is she offered a new feminist interpretation of the fall. For many years, people in early America and also in Western Europe interpreted the fall as this. People suggested that it was Eve who was most inherently sinful because she was the first to eat the forbidden fruit. And this was used as justification for women not participating in politics. Women were seen as more inherently sinful and in need of male control. And what Judith SargentMurray did is she reinterpreted the story. What she said was that the way of understanding, the traditional way of understanding the fall was wrong. What actually happened is that Eve was so thirsty for knowledge. She was so curious. It was her drive to understand that caused her to eat the forbidden fruit. And it was Adam who was simply weak. He didn't have that same drive. He knew what happened when you ate the apple. He simply did it because Eve did. So she's arguing that it was Eve's thirst for knowledge. Women are not inherently sinful. They're inherently interested in learning. And this argument was quite radical at the time, controversial, especially because she was suggesting that Adam, the first man, was a follower of a woman. Another important example was what she said in her catechism. She said, whatever is essential to the ethereal spark which animates these transient tenements, meaning the body, the impermanent body, will exist when the distinction of male and female shall forever be absorbed. This thought stimulating hath banished the diffidence excited by reflections merely sexual. Admitting, however, the door of science barred to us, the path of truth notwithstanding, and the page of revelation lies open before us. There, clothed with becoming reverence, we may freely expatiate. It is this walk, aspiring as I am, I have presumed with trembling awe to enter. So she says, this body is what's sexual, not the soul. And we have been barred from truth, and truth is our right because we have equal souls to men. So she's staking a claim for the equality of sexes, not because of contributions to the Republic. She's not saying I need to learn, other women need to learn because they need to educate their children. She's saying they need to learn it because it's what God designed. God designed all human beings to learn. And you have to look no farther than the most famous essay that historians often interpret as being evidence for her Republican motherhood to see this. So she says, and this is on the equality of the sexes, published in 1790, I would calmly ask, is it reasonable that a candidate for immortality, for the joys of heaven, an intelligent being who is to spend an eternity in contemplating the works of deity, should at present be so degraded as to be allowed no other ideas than those suggested by the mechanism of a pudding or the sewing of the seams of the garment. So again, she's saying, I don't need to learn to be at home. I need to learn because I am a candidate for immortality. I'm an intelligent being, and I, like men, am going to spend the afterlife contemplating God. So shouldn't I have the opportunity to cultivate my mind while on Earth? And in another interesting private work that was never published, she actually positions herself in a debate with a doctor, with a reverend, and with a physicist, all three male figures that would have commanded a lot of respect in this time for their professions. Not only is she able to keep up with them in this fictional conversation that she creates, but she actually outsmarts them and understands religion better than they do. And so she clearly is making a statement that not only can women compete with men, but they can even surpass men's intellectual capability in some cases. So overall, you see a common thread throughout many of her works. In a lot of her writings, both public and private, she makes an argument for the superiority of the soul. And she connects the soul to the mind. The body is what's transient and impermanent. It's what's inferior. And the mind is what is linked with the soul and with the afterlife, which is the ultimate goal of all individuals who are universalists, of course, and also many Christians as well. Really, all Christians at this time. She constructs an argument that women should be seen on a more equal plane with men because God creates them ultimately to end in the same place. In a perfect world for her, she sees that women can cultivate their education equally to men, not just enough so that they can teach their children, but equally. She believes that this will fulfill a woman and will prepare her for her afterlife, but it also will bring her a lot of strength and happiness while in life. She believes that only when a woman is educated can she be an equal companion in marriage. She believes that only when a woman is educated can she have self-reverence or self-confidence, and it's only when these things occur that a woman can attain earthly happiness. And in an era where people are discussing the divine right to pursue your happiness, she sees education and the cultivation of reason as essential for these things. And what's interesting to note here as well, and I think there's some work that can be done here, that a lot of women who were involved in the women's rights movement later, of the next generations, when we recognize there as actually being a full-blown women's rights movement in the mid-1800s, a lot of these women came from liberal religions, just like Judith SargentMurray. Maybe they weren't all Universalists, some were Unitarians, and then some were Quakers, which is slightly different. But a lot of these women, if you look at what they said, made calls for women's rights for this very same reason. Their justifications had a lot to do with the connection between the mind and the soul, and the fact that neither of these things have a gender. And in some early stages of research, some of these names may sound a little more familiar. Women like Margaret Fuller and Lucretia Mott and Caroline Dahl all made similar calls for liberty based upon the idea that human souls were equal and superior to the body. So in conclusion, I want to just reiterate why I think it's important that she be studied. She's another example of a great woman. If you go to a junior high or if you go to an elementary school, young people are still doing a biography on a very limited number of women. If you go to Borders or Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com, there are very few biographies that are on prominent female figures. And what this means is that women's history hasn't fully trickled down to the level of the public. And so if you have another figure that can be interesting to people, you can integrate women's history more into the mainstream narrative. But it has some more academic, it has more to offer to academic areas and the historiography as well. It provides a new way to understand women in religious history. Usually women are seen as either belonging to this class of women who are good wives, they do not press against social norms, and they're very pious. They're sort of the passive religious followers. And then these women are often juxtaposed to women who are transgressive, women like Anne Hutchinson or the mother Anne Lee, who stepped out of their traditional domestic roles and boldly adopted what were considered masculine roles. So there's sort of one or the other. You're either this passive female or you're this transgressive female. And that's how, surprisingly, even to this day, a lot of women's history as related to religion is done in the United States. And she doesn't fit neatly into either of these categories. She lived what people of her time would have called a traditional life, as she was a devoted wife and mother. And she did not preach, and she did not go against the hierarchy of her church. She didn't call for women to vote in church matters, but she was undoubtedly a religious leader. And she did step outside of these gender norms by writing and by discussing with men on an equal plane religious ideas, by interpreting scripture for herself, and then for publishing some of these works and these ideas. And also, of course, from extrapolating a feminist ideology from these works. So is she a religious leader in the traditional sense? No. But did she contribute extensively to the growth of Universalism? Yes. You can also see her as a precursor to the women's rights movement of the 19th century. And so far, there's no comparison that has been done between Judith SargentMurray and her ideas on later 19th century ideas. And I have a little bit more work to do here, but what my inclination is that they had a lot in common. Perhaps she was not a part of a full-blown moment or movement, but she definitely had feminist ideas that need to be recognized as a part of the history of women's rights. And often she doesn't get all of that recognition that she deserves. So thank you for listening to me. I always appreciate a forum to discuss her, as I do see her as very key to understanding women's history. And I'd like to take any questions that you may have.
Just an informational question. You said that there were a whole series of letters that were found in a basement in 1975, and maybe one of the reasons, I'd like to know the circumstances, and then, where the basement was and whose basement.
Yeah.
And the other part of it was maybe the reason she's not better known in terms of her private writing, because that's a big body of letters,
Yeah.
and other people haven't had a chance to look.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one of the issues. The letters got to Mississippi because at the end of her life, she actually had a daughter, and her daughter married a man from Mississippi, and when she was older, she went to live with her daughter, and she brought all of these letters with her. So that's how they ended up in Mississippi. And there has been some access to these letters, but they're available in only about 10 universities, and just luckily they happen to be. It was like a amazing coincidence. I didn't even know that UCLA was one of the only universities that had these collections. So there's limited access to the works, and they're not published. So definitely that's a reason why. But it has been 20 years, and she's still being discussed in this limited way. So lucky for me, she is, because it gave me a great project to work on. And I'm excited to be able to show the complexity of her life.
Did she correspond with Abigail Adams writing?
She did. Not frequently, but she wrote both to Abigail Adams. She had met her on a couple occasions. Also Martha Washington and Hannah Adams and Sarah Keating, who is another female author. So she had kind of a circle of people she corresponded with.
How did you come to get interested in this person?
Well, actually, I started, I was going to do a dissertation on the history of happiness. And my advisor said that was too amorphous, and that it sounded like something that I could write that people would actually read, and I had to pick a different topic that was more narrow for my dissertation. And so when I had been doing some research about happiness, I had come across her writings, and then I started to look into her a little bit more, and I realized that there was a lot of work to be done. I saw this as a more realistic project. And something that I needed to do, and she does talk about, and this wasn't a focus of my lecture, but a lot of her writings talk about happiness and her own lack of happiness and why she's not happy, and how you can only attain happiness in the afterlife. So I had been doing research about happiness and got to that from.
My third question is, did you find anyone in her life period that referenced her?
I haven't found much of that yet. And her, she was of a prominent circle, so she corresponded frequently with a lot of ministers of the time, and they wrote back and forth. So she was somebody that people who were involved in the Universalist movement knew, that people in Boston knew. She was, her neighbors were, very well-known, wealthy Boston families. So people were aware of her. Were people like Margaret Fuller and Susan B. Anthony and other women like that writing about her? I wish, but I haven't seen any of that. No.
Well, the reason I said that is because you were making, I thought, a thesis that she was influencing the next generation.
Well, not necessarily that she was influencing them, but that she has more, that she was ahead of her time and that she had these ideas that people later conceptualize and are given credit for kind of coming up with. So it's not necessarily that she directly influenced them, but that she had some of these ideas earlier on. Michelle, did you have?
Oh, well, my question has to do with that, because Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes along later with some other women to write a history of the women's movement, so she's not mentioned.
No, she's not, unfortunately. And that's probably one of the reasons why she hasn't gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah, I mean, I read Equality of the Sexes, that's getting read a lot.
That's really what she's known for, is really that essay. And if you take a women's history class, U.S. women's history class, certainly that's part of the curriculum. And even, she uses the example of women after the revolution. It's kind of the little snippet that you get about her life.
On the level of ideas, clearly she paid attention to the notion in Genesis of creation and of sin. Everyone's going to go to heaven, though, so what's the expulsion from the Garden of Eden about? How does she deal with predestination as part of the Calvinist tradition? It's her background.
Yeah, that's kind of a flaw in Universalism. It's actually, both she and her husband and some of these early Universalist ministers tend to sweep things under the rug that don't make a lot of sense. And the religion wasn't incredibly successful, like in comparison to Unitarianism. They had a much larger following, and probably part of that was that they didn't answer questions. They said, "I don't know a lot."
Pretty polite.
Yeah, I know. And they said, "I don't know a lot." I mean, the way that they did believe in original sin, and they did say that there was original sin, and that's linked back to Adam and Eve, but everybody was forgiven from the moment of birth because Jesus died for everyone's sins. So that's why I mentioned that it was like a Christocentric religion, and they said, yes, people have original sin, but for all people, past, present, and future, Christ died for them, and so that's kind of how they dealt with the concept of that. But they did say, I don't know a lot.
To the point about predestinationism, they would have addressed it implicitly. Everyone's predestined to heaven.
But yeah, exactly. So they kind of took a more expanded notion. And the idea was that, God was a benevolent being. He wasn't this person to be feared in these other evangelical Christian religions. And that actually fearing him was not carrying out the mission that he wanted to be loved. He wanted to be loved, not feared. And so that was a part of their justification. And they said, if God is creating you, and if he's omniscient, and if he's perfect, then wouldn't everything that he created be perfect as well? And that was how they explained universal salvation. Are there any other questions? Uh-huh.
Well, so this brings me to my second question. It's related. So I study liberalism a lot, and I had never heard the definition of liberalism as everyone goes to heaven.
Yeah. Well, for liberal,
how does that? Is there linking to the political idea of liberalism in this notion of calling it a liberal?
Liberal Christian. I mean, with liberal Christianity, I mean it's associated often with like Enlightenment ideas. So that's why it's often
individual rights or individual.
Well,
capacity,
of the individual capacity for the human mind to be cultivated. So that's where that link is. It's not associated necessarily with the politics of liberalism. So it's kind of another definition of liberal. They needed another word, perhaps.
Yeah.
So liberal Christianity is often seen as in opposition to evangelical Christianity. Liberal Christianity is often considered elitist. That you had people who in Harvard in the 19th century were liberal Christians, and they were criticized by the transcendentalist movement for not extending this idea of human equality far enough, and the transcendentalist movement kind of came out of that. So it's a very different idea than like a classical liberal.
So they would actually go around and call themselves liberal Christians. That would be.
That's a historical. It's a historical term.
Okay.
So
That's what I was.
yeah.
Okay.
You talked about how she saw the world in class hierarchical terms. She also talked about women's minds as being equal, or minds being equal, and women having minds that were equal to the minds that men had. Within classes, were people supposed to be equal?
No. And that's where she has a little bit of hypocrisy in her ideas are not perfect. She believed that there was a natural order, but that it wasn't a gendered order.
Yeah, but within classes?
Within classes?
So working class people would be equal?
Yes.
And
Yes.
elites would be
Yes.
equal of various sorts?
Yes. And she believed that, so she had a lot of servants in her life because she was this elite woman. She didn't have slaves, but she did have servants, both black and white. And she was very interested in proselytizing to them. She wanted them to become Universalist. But she did, and she also educated them. She would take in orphan girls who would work in some capacity as servants for her, and she would educate them. So she had a little bit of schizophrenia, I think, with what she actually believed when she encountered people who were of a lower class. She did, kind of try and allow them to cultivate their minds. But on a political level, she associated with the Federalist Party, and she wrote political essays that have been published in a compilation called The Gleaner, where she talks about the need for political order and her support of the Federalist Party. So her ideas are not always necessarily in conjunction with her practice. Uh-huh.
It seems to me that you're equating mind with the political status. She's still consistent in that the mind is equal. At whatever level she's educating the person, that's not to be crossed over, I think, with the body states and the class states in the body.
Well, right.
So it seems to me she's not of two minds. She's still of one mind.
Interesting. I'll have to think about that a little bit more.
One other question, and I'll shut up because I said too much. And that is, she didn't push the issue of voting because that was outside the realm of imagination. Did she have any inclination about women owning property?
She did. And she never made any sort of public call for that, but in her private letters, she wrote to some females in her family, cousins that had, maybe lost their husband and they didn't get all of their property rights, and so she noted the inequality of that and was very concerned about it. One of her other projects, besides calling for women's education, was for women's self-sufficiency. And she wanted women to be able to protect themselves because she recognized that the law wasn't necessarily going to do that. She wanted women to be able to, she called it self-reverence. And what that meant was that women would be able to pursue a single life if they wanted to. And also that the idea of a widow would not be something that was so really threatening. She said, one day hopefully widow and widowers will be in the same category of mourning, and that's it. So she was very aware that the problems that could arise if women, because she herself had been abandoned. Her husband had gambled and had built a home that was too large, and he left her for the West Indies. And she wasn't able to get a divorce either, because an abandoned woman wasn't always able to get a divorce. But she had and he was gone for years. And she had to wait until he died to remarry. So she was very, conscious of the way in which laws restricted what women were able to do, and she was vocal about that, but only in these private letters.
So in some ways, she was setting the stage then for an argument to come. She was prefiguring the argument about women having the right to govern themselves.
But in not, the traditional sense. I mean, you could argue that she did have political ideas. She just didn't frame them in what we consider, traditional calls. She didn't ask explicitly to vote, but she recognized that inequality and was very unhappy about it and expressed this to other people. So in a way, you have to understand her contributions, you kind of have to get out of these traditional understandings of what a political leader, what a religious leader was, or even what the traditional women's rights movement actually is to really see. She was abandoned, and so she had to wait to get married. So she was left in a pretty dire financial situation. Luckily, she had a wealthy father, and she knew that it was only because she had a wealthy father that she was really okay. So in order to get a divorce, you had to make there were certain ways that women could get a divorce, and they were very, very uncommon even in the post-revolutionary era. And they didn't know where he was or if he was coming back, and so she had to wait till she got word that he was dead in order to remarry. And it's kind of unclear whether or not she had started her relationship with her second husband already. She never says that she did, but she had really intimate letters with him starting much earlier than their marriage. So that's something we'll probably never have an answer to. I think she was smart enough not to leave that in record. She cared a lot about her public persona. She very much cared what people thought about her. And she said this expressly. She said, "I care about what people think about me." And that's probably why you can see a lot more radical ideas in her private letters than in her public. She didn't want people to see her like Mary Wollstonecraft. So if you read the Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is often seen as like one of the most important first feminist texts, it's very similar to On the Equality of the Sexes. What Mary Wollstonecraft and Judith SargentMurray say are very similar, but Judith SargentMurray didn't really challenge too much traditional roles in her own private life. I mean, definitely as an author, and in her religion she did, but sort of in her more private life, as a mother and as a wife and as a daughter, she was very traditional. Mary Wollstonecraft said very similar things, but lived what people at the time considered an incredibly immoral life. She had affairs, illegitimate children, she tried to kill herself, and so what she said was met with incredible scrutiny. And you have Judith SargentMurray really saying very similar things, but she doesn't get that sort of scrutiny because of her acceptance into by John Adams and Abigail Adams. And it's kind of interesting. So she wrote a series of essays called The Repository, and it was it wasn't weekly, but it was maybe bi-monthly for about 2 years, 1792 to 94. And she wrote on sometimes they would be very kind of benign topics. She'd write about spring or how wonderful nature was, or maybe she'd write a very laudatory article about George Washington. But she wrote some others that were slightly more controversial. She talked about death and from a very universalist perspective. She also talked about this idea of the fallen woman. So this, at the time, people were really concerned, or there was a whole real literary movement that was very popular called sentimental fiction. And in this fiction, there was a very basic storyline where a woman would kind of go against her parents' wishes, or she wouldn't have parental guidance, and she'd have two men that she could court. One who was this perfect man who she could go and live this Republican wonderful life with, and this other man who she loved and was attracted to, who secretly had these designs to just seduce and abandon her. And the woman would always choose that man, the archetypal bad boy. She'd go with him, and then she'd meet a terrible fate. And a lot of people saw this as prescriptive literature. This is a cautionary tale. Women, don't do this. Listen to your parents. Marry this type of person. Live this traditional life, or else look what happens to you. And she would write under a male name about the need to forgive women who had made these mistakes. And she'd again kind of wrap this in this universal idea. People make mistakes, people sin. This is a sin. God forgives sin. We all go to heaven. Christ died for this. And she would write that as a man. She interestingly called herself a gleaner, and she was really concerned that people, if they ever found out that she was actually a woman, would think that she was plagiarizing. And so she said, I'm gleaning, I'm kind of skimming off of what's been left, and so you can't accuse me of having unoriginal ideas, because that's what I'm doing. I'm observing what people are doing and saying.
Yeah, there's something that I was thinking of. A lot of feminists from the early 19th century and the 19th century, sometimes they're referred to as liberal feminists. I prefer the term classical feminist, it is more encompassing. Have been accused by different feminists in the 20th century of, and I love the word, somatophobia, fear of the body, because they have focused exactly on the mind being the most important thing. Because I'm in philosophy, so I see the tradition from Plato all the way through Descartes, and focusing on the life of the mind being more important than the life of the body and so forth. But of course it fits perfectly in focusing on education. And this, in a way, of course, ties in beautifully with what you've just been talking about, because if the souls are the same, the minds and spirits are the same, and in this world gender exists, but in the afterlife gender does not exist, I would assume that some different feminists would accuse Murray of somatophobia. However, there's a person with a traditional life, having kids and enjoying it,
Exactly.
and you can't accuse her.
No,
of
you can't, because she says yes. There, and in fact, she mentions this. There's a passage in an essay she wrote, probably her second most famous essay, called "Observations on Female Abilities," and in this she says, yes, if you look at history, men are stronger. They're the soldiers. They're the people who can do the hard physical labor. Yes, that's true. You can't deny that, but when you look at these things and you look at understanding the mind, which is what's important, then that doesn't matter. Yes, there's going to be a difference in Earth, in life, but that's not what's important. Yes, you do, as a woman, want to be a mother, and yes, you do have this desire to be with your husband, and but there's that, and there's also this other state that you need to be prepared for. So it's kind of a unique idea there. Yeah, she's very different from, she has some similarities, but she's also very unique as well because of exactly that. And I would be interested to see if you couldn't look at people like Margaret Fuller or some of these women who are involved in the transcendentalist movement and the women's rights movement, and see if they had anything similar to that to say. I haven't gotten to, that's chapter 6, and I haven't gotten there yet, so I don't have a lot to say there.
Just along that line of the somatophobia, I think that lovely formal portrait of her, and clearly elite woman, clearly not corseted into the shape she was supposed to be. I would think that from the 20th, 21st century perspective, at least since women got rid of the girdles, much more significant to my way of thinking than burning bras, that really shows, I think, a certain comfort with her body that was very not late 18th, early 19th century.
Right. Yeah, no, it's true, and she was, you couldn't at all call her a transcendentalist or anything like that, but she was interested in this connection between the spirit and the body in a way that I think, she was definitely influenced by the Enlightenment, but she had these different ideas as well. And I think that picture is just great because I think it's just really symbolizes her kind of in a nutshell. It's this elite picture. It's done by Copley, who's this really important painter who's doing all these portraits of all these really famous people, and she's posing like she's supposed to, and she has these flowers, and she looks like the domestic female until you look really carefully and you see she's not wearing her corset. So that's kind of how she behaved in all these readers. She, on the surface, is this Republican mother, and I see why people, without having read all of these private works, don't focus on that, because it's illuminated only after you read all of these private works. If I had read On the Equality of the Sexes as an undergrad, and I definitely bought what they had to say about her being this Republican mother. And I think if you only read that, you don't, that slide I had where I, highlighted the red, you don't see that as highlighted. You see maybe more, where she's talking about reason, or she's talking about, these domestic things, or later on in this essay she talks about, wanting to educate her children. So you can focus on those things. But when you go back after having read all of her private works, this just pops out in a way that can't it can't be ignored. So. Mm-hmm.
Did you get the impression from her advocacy for education for girls that maybe, although she didn't talk about voting or anything later, but maybe she meant gradually if girls are educated and then they grow up, then will be more participating in society, will ask or demand more rights?
Maybe, because she has this essay that is not published. It's called On Curiosity. And she says, first, I know that women are accused of being curious because they're gossips, right? That women are usually condemned for being curious. They're trying to, find out about their neighbors. But if we just let them learn, that curiosity would turn into something like Newton. That, if Newton hadn't been curious, would he have ever discovered gravity? If Thomas Jefferson hadn't been, curious or interested in learning, would he have written these treaties on government? Would he be, would he have written the Declaration of Independence? So she doesn't say women need to contribute in political ways or to the economy, but she says we don't know what women can contribute. So in a way, she does. People always ask that question of if you could go back and meet anyone living, or I always say her because I could write one hell of a dissertation if I could go and meet her, But I always wonder, I try to think, if I had asked her those questions, how would she have answered it? Because she's very concerned about about fitting into society. She had a lot of pressure on her. Her brother was a close friend of George Washington. In fact, he named his son George Washington and personally asked Martha Washington if that was okay. And he was given a lot of favors. He became the governor of Mississippi. And she was from a very highfalutin family that had a lot of scrutiny on her. So she was concerned that she could fit into that society. She liked it. She liked nice things. And so I don't know how she really viewed herself. I think she was afraid to see herself as a trailblazer. But she was, even if she didn't even always admit it to herself. She's funny. She is a little schizophrenic because she'll be talking about the importance of manners and decorum, and this woman was too flirtatious. But then she talks about the need to forgive women who make these errors and how important it is that women be revered as men are. And there's a little bit of conflict you can see in her, but ultimately, these ideas do prevail in the bulk of her writings.
I have become fascinated with the corset issue. Mary brought it up again, and is there something that she writes about that you came to this assumption, or is it underneath that picture that she's not having? Because I didn't notice whether she had one or not. So I'm wondering how did you come to that conclusion? Is it written in her work?
No, it's not. But she talks about fashion explicitly and the need not to follow fashion trends.
Can you flip back?
Yeah, I can show. Let's see. You can just tell. I mean, if you look, one thing I wish I could show you right now was pull up some other pictures of other women at the time, and it's really obvious in the way that the dress falls that she's not.
So this is your assumption?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah. I mean, but if you compare her to I mean, it's pretty clear this is a pretty informal. I mean, it's a formal dress. It's like fancy silk material, but she's not. It's not laced up. It's not tight fitting anyway. I wish I knew for what reason she did. If she had mentioned that.
It could also be just that it's sort of the classical ideal.
Yeah, it could.
Because that was real
It
big.
could. It's hard. I always find myself reading these diaries, and I wish I could ask questions. What exactly? Well, what about, because I see a hint of something, but there's no way that I could possibly prove it, She talks about, she's really upset about animals being mistreated, and for a while she even, gets upset about eating fish, and she's from Gloucester. So Gloucester is, it still is today, right? If you've seen The Perfect Storm, that movie is based out of Gloucester. So she sometimes writes, I feel so bad for these poor fish, So I always wondering, did she have any idea that animals had souls, which would have been really radical. But I can't. There's nothing. I can't say that because there's not enough evidence to really substantiate that. Now she also suffered from depression a lot. I mean, there was no knowledge of like postpartum depression, but she really had postpartum depression. You can tell because, she says when she has a child and then all of a sudden for the next few months she's really talks about her melancholy and she's really sad, and then she'll get better, and then she has another child and same thing again, and she was unaware of that. So she's really concerned with the connection between the way that she feels and her happiness, and whether or not she should have happiness on earth or in the afterlife. I haven't fully formalized a thought about what all of that means yet. But there's just a lot that comes through in her letters. There's a lot of really boring ones too, where she talks about the weather and her, that I have to read. But some days I'll go through and I'm like, didn't anything interesting happen to you?
That's when she was melancholy.
That's when she's melancholy. Yeah. Do you really just, go to this dinner and see this person? That's it? You don't have anything to say about women's rights today? But on the days when I do find one, it'll make my month, this is for chapter 4. So, great. Any other questions?
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.